Hello everybody, Happy New Year. Welcome to the new current year. The new current year is of course 2018. So I figured this is something I've been wanting to do for a while and I've just kind of had low agency so I haven't gotten around to it. But today we're going to talk about my political views. Woohoo! So we're going to say what were they initially, how did I come about them, what's kind of my background, all that sort of fun stuff. So let's get into it, shall we? So I'm just going to be playing Assassin's Creed Unity, which I got during the Steam Summer Sale. That is what it is. So I'm just going to be going through this in a narrative fashion, and you can ask me questions about particular stuff. I missed the Death and Rebirth stream. Will you upload that? No, because it was god awful. It was really, 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 really bad. The Death and Rebirth stream. I rage quit it. I just kind of yelled at it and rage quit it because it was shit. So let's see here. Political background. So I come, as I've said, from an upper middle class family. So pretty much everybody in my family, my immediate family, has always voted Conservative. Now, that's Canadian Conservative, but they've either voted Progressive Conservative at a provincial level or at a federal level. I think they voted Progressive Conservative at a federal level. They didn't vote for the Alliance. So because I don't know, I'm not going to get into the alliance thing. But yeah, my father's always kind of been center-right. He identified as what's called in Canada a red Tory. Red Tories were the descendants of high Toryism in Canada. So initially it meant people who were kind of paternalistic, but also kind of conservative. So it was people who were, I guess you could say, conservative on social matters, but liberal, or what's generally considered liberal in the Western world, on economic matters. Like, there was not a huge amount of difference between the progressive conservative and liberal party on those kind of issues in the past. So you have that aspect to it. So that was kind of my father's. Now, my grandfather was, I guess you could call him kind of a paleo-conservative. It is probably a good way to discuss him. He was very conservative. He was not a red Tory. He was a blue Tory, which is kind of the further right version of it. But he was a lot more socially conservative than my father was. So he was against gay marriage. He was against gay marriage. He was against mass immigration, multiculturalism, all that kind of thing. He was a lot more, I guess you could say, just right-winged in general than my father was. So, yeah, my grandfather was a lifelong Tory. Although I think he might have voted NDP once or twice back when the NDP was a little more of a working class party. Okay, I've already bought stuff from him. I don't need to buy more stuff. I'm out of money anyways. So, yeah, so that's what kind of happened back in the day. So my grandfather also had kind of, I guess you could say, patriarchal, paternalistic views. He was more of a economic conservative than my father was, although he supported universal health care. He was also very pro-America. The only reason he was actually almost kind of, he wanted union with America. His only objection is he didn't want American-style healthcare, which I think is understandable because American-style healthcare is a disaster. It's always been a disaster, and it probably always will be a disaster. So, yeah, or technically his kind of position on gay marriage was he didn't really like it. He was in favor of civil unions. He didn't think that same-sex couples should ever be given the title marriage because marriage is for procreative purposes primarily. Um, yeah, so he was kind of the biggest political influence, I suppose, on me. So I'd say he's kind of a paleocon. He really in particular, he hated Packies and what's it called again? Who's the other guys? Jamaicans. He really, really disliked Jamaicans, which I can't really blame him for. If you live in the GTA, you're probably going to dislike both of them because they're responsible for most of the crime. So that was kind of my background. I think there was a lot of aspects in addition to that that was about... Yeah, because the area where they lived was, I think 2 decades ago was about 95% white, and now it's like 70% East Asian. So it's undergone rapid transformation. Like probably the best example of that in the GTA is Markham, which used to be kind of like the WASP Central, but now it's so Asian that the signs there are in Chinese. Oftentimes the English signs are secondary to the Chinese signs. So that stuff happened. So I think the other thing regarding kind of my political views, and I think this is kind of a meme, because there's this meme, kids aren't born to hate. But it's the exact opposite. Because liberals have all these anti-bullying problems, and they talk about how kids make fun of people for being different. Kids are the most, and I use this term unironically, xenophobic people you'll ever meet. They bully and beat up anybody who's slightly different. They will find something, be it your last name, be it if you wear glasses, be it if you have, I don't know, a mole on your face. They will come up with a nickname and they will mock you and relentlessly over it. So that's kind of an aspect of kids. So I remember in my case, the first time I saw a black kid, I was like, what the hell is this thing? And I think a lot of people are probably like that. Same thing with kind of the Chinese or Muslims or that kind of thing. I think people naturally are, I guess you could say, xenophobic, and it takes a lot of conditioning to break that. You kind of have to force yourself. It's really hard, and it shatters really easily for most people. And the people it doesn't kind of shatter for often get very the internal contradictions often kind of collapse within their heads. So there's that aspect to it. Also, as someone who I think I had childhood bipolar, I guess you could retroactively diagnose it. Also severe anxiety disorders. And I do think there is some truth to the idea that people who have anxiety disorders or that kind of thing naturally are more likely to embrace kind of right-wing politics. So I think there is a natural xenophobia there. And by xenophobia, I just mean a innate dislike or distrust of things that are different. It doesn't necessarily mean racially. It also just means in terms of, I don't know, something as simple as they don't want to switch clothes. They like wearing the clothes they like to wear. They don't like their routine to be interrupted. They don't like to try new foods. I think that is fairly common among people with anxiety disorders. And I think that's part of the reason why in these circles there's so many people who have those kind of disorders. Because there's plenty of people who have the politics who are completely neurotypical, but I think there is a higher percentage chance. So because I had severe depression even as a child, and I've been suicidal as far back as I remember when I was 6 or 7, I used to fantasize about sticking my head into a pillow until I expired and suffocated myself to death when I was very young. I think that was as young as grade 4. I had those kind of inclinations. So you have that kind of fun stuff. Also, in addition to that, there's... I'm trying to think what else there is. Kill the messenger without being seen. Okay. So, what I'm trying to say is, actually, when I was very young, like 8 or 9, I would identify myself as like a Nazi, actually. I kind of idealized Hitler when I was really young, just because I viewed him as having killed the most people in human history. And I hated humanity. I saw them as a virus that needed to be wiped out and extinguished from the face of the earth. Can we talk about the... We'll talk about that later. I'll get to that in a little bit. I'm just going to go through at least the first part of this before I start kind of branching off into other things. So yeah, I really kind of idealized that. But so I idealized that. I hated... what else was there? What else did I hate? I hated democracy because I thought most people were stupid and they should not have any, I guess you could say, ability to vote, because I just thought they weren't capable of acting in their own best interest. And I guess that's kind of a view I've held for most of my life. So eventually I went on to school, and I just guess you could describe myself as being kind of like a normie conservative, because just because I didn't know anything about politics, but everyone in my family was a conservative. So I just hated the Liberal Party, and I just thought they were corrupt and shitty. It was during a time in Canadian politics where we were a de facto one-party state, because the right-wing vote was divided between at least 2 political parties, probably 3. So because of that, the Liberals had a one-party state, and they just did whatever they want. So, yeah, so I just described myself as being a conservative over time. So I guess kind of around this time, some of the views I have that have never changed is I've always been just very moralistic in terms of kind of my political views. I've always really, really hated adultery. I actually hated divorce from a very young age. I saw divorce as being like a really bad thing. When I was really young, I really disliked gay marriage. Really disliked kind of that sort of thing in general. That was kind of an issue where I really had to like forcibly reprogram myself on, because it went so much against my natural inclinations. So I think the other thing you have to understand about this era, the early 2000s, is this was when identity politics was solely a product of the left, and the right, as we called it then, was solely about economic issues. Lower taxes, that kind of thing. There was not any... Even kind of social conservatism at that point had completely given way. And what assassin's suit is that? I forget. I think it's one of the ones that came with the DLC, because when I bought this, it had like a bunch of the DLC packaged in. So I think it's one of those. But what was I thinking of again? So yeah, so that was kind of what it was like during the time period, as it were. Just it was all about economics, etc. So I think what kind of, as I kind of got older, in particular when I got into high school, is I started to come across diversity more and more. I found out this week I had She Isn't Alive, another self-hating right-wing Jewish family member. Okay, that's interesting. But what was I saying? Yeah, so like when we had some stuff during the early political, like when we had a bit of political talk during school, I was like the only kid in the class who was against gay marriage, because I thought it was like an important civilizational institution, and I objected to the idea of just unilaterally rewriting something that was so important. So I guess that was a right-wing view I held. I strongly supported military deterrent, nuclear deterrent, capital punishment. I thought voting should be restricted to people with high IQs or people who were informed on issues. And those were kind of, I guess, kind of some of the early edgy positions I had. So kind of over time, yeah, because people, basically I remember in class, what people said to me was, Argent, I support gay marriage because of will and grace. Because I like will and grace, so I think I support it for that reason. And I was actually in favor of civil unions. Now, when I got older, I actually briefly changed my opinion on it, but that was because I thought a lot of the degenerate aspects of that lifestyle, and I thought it was a degenerate lifestyle even when I was like 12 or 13, because that's kind of where I live. You have to understand, Toronto is kind of like the San Francisco of the North, so we have one of the largest pride parades in the world. So, like, when I was younger, my grandfather would show me footage of it, and I'd see, like, people in thongs, like, people fucking on parade floats, stuff like that, and it just triggered an extremely strong disgust reaction. Just kind of the degree to which it was just so hedonistic, the degree to which there was no fidelity, that kind of thing. Because that was very important to me. I didn't even really like divorce at that age. So, no, I just thought it was an utterly disgusting lifestyle. And what I kind of figured eventually, my justification for why I supported it, is I thought part of the reason for that lifestyle is because normal relationships were denied to them as a society. So I thought if you legalized it and you tried to normalize that, it would make them act more like normal married couples, which I wound up being completely wrong about, but that was kind of my logical justification. But yeah, so let me think what else happened. So that was kind of where I was at that point in time. I was like the only person who was conservative. I was the only person who kind of had, I don't know if you call them edgy views, but just kind of views like that in that environment, as it were. So that stuff all happened, and I kind of just was going along. So when I got to university, this was around the time of year, I remember 9/11 really changed my view of the world. I think 9/11 changed a lot of people's view of the world. But it was really the first time I came to terms with non-Western civilizations. In particular, Islam and a lot of this other stuff. That, like, I was just very ignorant that other cultures even existed when I was in school, because the area I lived in was mainly white with Asians, and Asians basically just kind of behave like white people anyways. In most cases, they have extremely low violent crime rates, intact families, kind of all that stuff. So I first kind of came across Islam, and I know one of the most defining moments of my political life was post 9/11, like the day of 9/11, when I saw all the like Muslims celebrating. I don't know if anyone else is old enough to remember this, but when 9/11 happened, they showed pictures from all over the world of Muslims celebrating and yelling about how glorious it was. And I hadn't realized that people supported terrorism. I think I was 10 years... Yeah, I was 10 years old when 9/11 happened. I'm in my late 20s, I guess you could say. So, yeah, so when 9/11 happened, I saw all that. It made me realize that, like, all this stuff was happening. And then when I started getting older, they were kind of trying to liberalize me. So they were showing us stuff, like, about the Congo. So there's stuff about the Congo, stuff about how poor people lived, how sophistical, artistical, that I remember that. The sight made me go rage of death on the spot. I thought you were in your mid-30s. I have a very old-sounding voice. Partially vocabulary, partially just the way I talk. A lot of people think I'm a lot older than I sound, just because my voice sounds older. I don't smoke or anything. It's just the way I talk. But what was I thinking about again? Yeah, so I'm 27 actually, if you're really wondering. What was I saying again? You sound like you always have a cold. You have to understand Canadian accents are just kind of nasally to begin with. Canadian accents are nasally, particularly Southern Ontario accents. Plus, I have bad allergies. Plus, I have... what was the other thing? I have a nonverbal learning disability. So I have a, I don't know what you call it, irregular prosody. So my voice kind of sounds like it. Yeah, so they like showed us something about the Congo War. And the Congo, the Congo War, just how people lived in third world countries. And I started kind of seeing it. I saw just kind of the widespread justification of terrorism, which I found was very common in these countries. And that it was kind of then I started to come to terms with that people in different cultures were fundamentally different. So the Iraq War happened, and I supported the Iraq War fairly strongly at that point in my life. Just because it was... just because it was what something Bush did, and I didn't really have established political ideas, so I just thought conservative good, so Iraq War was good. So, I guess kind of the next big thing was when I went to high school and I started coming in contact with, I guess you could say, shadier minorities. It was around that time we started getting a lot of Pakis moving in. And basically what the Pakis told to me was, Argent, as soon as we're the majority, we're gonna kill all of you white boys. We're gonna impose like Islamic culture. Like, I'm not joking. They literally said this. You're gonna be the minority soon, and we're gonna like take over, and your people are just gonna get wiped out. And they said this to me, and they're like, you better come to terms with it. Although we aren't gonna allow you to continue to exist at all. What was basically what they told me. And they would just disrespect me. They disrespect the Queen. They disrespect kind of any aspect of Anglo culture. They also just disrespected the teachers and stuff like that. So there's that. Also, with regards to the Chinese immigrants we had, even the ones who were born here, they had absolutely no interest in Canadian culture. Like, because I remember having a discussion with someone, and I was into history, and I'm like, do you know anything about, like, the Roman Empire? They're like, what's the Roman Empire? What's World War II? What's Shakespeare? Who's Julius Caesar? What's the United... Like, they didn't know anything about it, and they were born here. And they had absolutely no interest in learning anything about it. To them, it was just something for white people. And it was kind of, they viewed it as the duty of Canada to adopt Chinese culture. They kind of took that perspective. So from a young age, I really despised multiculturalism. Because to my mind, it was basically just cultural imperialism from immigrants. And I also kind of took the perspective that we as a society had no interest whatsoever in assimilation. I've always been a very big advocate, even at a young age, of assimilation. And I kind of took a lot of I just really hated it, because I kind of viewed it as, we're letting these people come into our country, we're giving them a better life than the shitholes they come from, and they can't even be bothered to learn the most basic things about the civilization they were joining. And that really bothered me. And this wasn't just kind of the Pakis and like the Dindus. This was also the Chinese. and they just kind of took the perspective that they were here to just kind of make money and had no ties to the land. So, have you ever considered moving to the U.S. for freedom reasons? I might eventually. I've really thought about it. Someday I might move to the U.S. It's definitely something I've been thinking about. Why didn't I get the dose of gamma rays? What does that mean? I have no idea what that means. But yeah, so that happened. So it was kind of around this time I met a guy who was a communist, and he started exposing me to all kinds of, I guess you could say, like radical left-wing stuff. Like, I'm trying to think of like, I don't know, like Michael Moore, kind of like Air America, Al Franken. I remember it was around this time I started listening to the Young Turks. So it was kind of, I think for me, the main thing that kind of I started to change on was economic issues. Because like I said, back in the day, economics was the new Far Cry featuring crazy Christian and rednecks from Montana as villains. It bothers me because I really like the Far Cry games in general. I know it was supposed to be left wing, but I did a reaction review on it. I actually thought Far Cry 3 was a really kind of interesting deconstruction of the whole white savior trope, and kind of an interesting deconstruction of the whole like video games as a male power fantasy. I know that sounds really like left wing and dildo, but I did find it a very interesting kind of perspective. I also really liked Far Cry 4. I just like the gameplay a lot in the Far Cry game, so it bothers me that the new one is so shitty. This was around grade 10, so I ran into a communist. So kind of my issue with conservatism was I viewed conservatism as being indifferent to moral issues. That all it was about money. So I kind of I kind of started to despise conservatism because I saw it as being against, how would I describe it, the Iraq War. Not because I supported it from the perspective of overthrowing dictatorships, and because I believed that force was the only way to change the world, and the idea that you could resolve anything through peace and talking was delusional. But I came to see the Iraq War as being solely about getting oil. And the more I kind of learned about the more I kind of learned about American history, the more I kind of became anti-America. Because I viewed most of kind of their interventions over the years, particularly in Latin America, as not being about communism, as not being about trying to improve the countries, but as being about getting money and economically exploiting these countries. So I guess you could say what I was really kind of interested in was left-wing nationalism. So, like, I really liked Kemal Ataturk a lot. I actually did a project on him. I liked him. I liked Lech Walesa a lot. I liked Mikhail Gorbachev a lot. I liked Yuan Perón a lot. So I kind of really liked third position ideologies a great deal back in the day. So that was kind of my perspective at that time. I increasingly became economically left-wing, and kind of left-wing on, like, I wanted nationalization of companies, more welfare, heavier taxes on the rich, destruction of economic globalism. Things like that are kind of, I guess, the positions I started taking at that age. I don't think there's much benefit to living in the U.S. over Canada. So I disliked all those kind of things, and I took those were kind of the perspectives I started to take. So kind of around this time, eventually, just because I got older and older, I learned more and more about other cultures. So, and that made me kind of more and more, I guess you could say, a Western supremacist. I didn't really believe in race necessarily, but I came to see Islam as a violent and barbaric culture. I came to see East Asians as kind of having, in many ways, not a primitive culture, but a culture completely lacking in morality, I guess you could say. Um, they kind of treated their own people like dirt, etc. And I kind of came to West as being the only civilization that supported human rights, and I meant human rights in kind of a moral. Faith Goldie is a Eastern Catholic. She's not Jewish at all. I think she's like a Ukrainian Catholic or something. No, but I thought Muslims, because I kind of considered myself a feminist to a certain extent back in the day. But, well, in a very, like, first wavy kind of conservative way, I guess you could say. But because I didn't like hijabs, I didn't like not letting women vote. I didn't like, just in general, the way women were treated in the Islamic world. And I still don't. But I viewed them as the natural enemy of Western civilization. And I viewed it as kind of being almost our destiny to oppose them. So I kind of thought of myself as a man of the old left. Kind of the pre-modern left, kind of prior to radicalism. I don't know, kind of the radicalism that overtook it. So kind of my perspective was my issue with the Iraq. No, she's not Greek Orthodox. She's Greek Catholic. There are Greek Catholics. There's just not very many of them. What was the other thing I was thinking about? So, yeah, I still had very kind of socially conservative views on a lot of issues. I kind of viewed the breakdown of the family to a certain perspective as being a result of capitalism and being a result of, like, I was always very much in favor of censorship of, like, things like adultery on TV, explicit sex. I was very much against showing children, that kind of thing. All that kind of stuff. And I kind of opposed that, I guess you could say, from kind of a bourgeoisie perspective, that I saw that as kind of capitalism corrupting the youth, which is kind of a position I still hold to be perfectly honest. So my issue with the Iraq War kind of eventually became not so much that it was a war in general, it was a war that I viewed as being fought purely for economic reasons. So yeah, I supported all that. So I kind of viewed that, and what I kind of eventually came to kind of believe, and this really developed during university when I learned even more about other cultures and the way that other civilizations worked, was I believed very much in, I guess you could say, white man's burden or the civilizing mission. So I thought it was our duty as a civilization to kind of bring back colonialism, reoccupy the primitive, what I viewed as the primitive and uncivilized powers, and forcing them into modernity and forcing them to stop being kind of degenerate shitholes. So that was kind of my perspective at that point in my life, and that kind of grew and grew throughout university, that sort of thing. So, yeah, that was my kind of perspective, and that kind of, I guess, kind of advanced as time went on. So when I entered university, it was kind of another shock to my system, because I supported kind of, I guess you could say, left-wing nationalism. Abstract, you probably remember this, but I remember we had a number of conversations where we back then at least lamented that National Socialism, the idea of National Socialism had been so tainted by Nazism. Because I kind of, if I had to describe my views, I kind of saw myself as being, I guess, a National Socialist. Although it was not civic nationalism or ethno-nationalism, but cultural nationalism. So yeah, so that was kind of my perspective. And I went into university, we used the term national populist. Yeah, that's kind of how we described ourselves. Specifically kind of middle-class populism was kind of how we viewed it. But so that was my issue with conservatism. So I went to university. I kind of went in as an economic leftist. And I kind of realized quickly that people in my classes were completely uninterested in economic leftism. So whenever I started to talk about nationalizing companies, redistribution of wealth, that kind of thing, people were just completely uninterested in it. Back then, economic leftism was a bigger thing. Left-wing nationalism was kind of fairly large. So I kind of supported left-wing nationalism for third world countries, but at the same time also cultural imperialism and kind of Western supremacism. Because I believed very kind of strongly in the whole, like I said, civilizing mission, etc. So I thought the left actually believed their rhetoric on human rights. So it was really interesting when I kind of started to go in and I started talking about, because slavery still existed in Africa. So I had said, I remember that I thought that we should expel Saudi Arabia and like all the countries that didn't respect human rights from the UN. I thought that we should get rid of, what was the other thing we should get rid of? That we should get rid of all the countries from the UN that supported slavery. And because I remember during the time period, Sudan was on the Human Rights Council. And I remember in one of my classes, I said Sudan should not be on the Human Rights Council when they're engaging in genocide against a minority. And people basically threatened me. The TA said, you better not talk that way or say things like that, or you'll get in trouble. So yeah, so people said stuff like that to me, and I was just like, what the hell is that about? Yeah, and so that was kind of the perspective I was going through that time period. And I would be very anti-Islam for feminist purposes because of its treatment of women. But basically, people would say, oh no, Islam is feminist. And they'd be like, Saudi Arabia not letting women drive is a form of feminism. So stuff like that. And it was very interesting. And over time, I was kind of like, why are they not living up to any of these things that they claim to stand for? Because they talk about all this stuff, they advocate all this stuff, but in reality, they don't actually stand by any of it. So yeah, that was kind of an interesting, I think, cultural perspective I was going through during that time period. I remember kind of some other interesting things was I was very pro-abortion at the time, largely because I just hated humanity and I thought the more people who were killed off, the better. But I remember in one of my classes, they talked a lot about sex-selective abortion and how bad it was because it was anti-woman. And I just said, well, I'm just pro-choice. So I think if women want to, I don't see a difference between aborting children because you feel like it and aborting children because they happen to be a different gender. And so I basically accused them of being pro-life. So people gave me a lot of shit over that. So kind of over time, as things went on, I just kind of became more and more disillusioned with the left. Because I found they wouldn't live up to any of the things that they said they would live up to. I also found they were completely unwilling to do any of the things necessary to bring about their world. Because it was clear to me that in a lot of cases, just the world they wanted would not come about through anything other than force and imposing civilization on kind of the lesser peoples. So that was kind of like how where my political thought was trending at that time. And over time, I became more and more alienated from the left. So I took to calling myself old left or pro-war left or like left with balls or that kind of thing. And over time, the left kind of became more and more like anti-nationalism, economic, like more and more kind of pro-capitalism and that kind of thing. So I kind of started to disappear, different on that. So eventually I kind of found Mark Stein. And Mark Stein is kind of one of the first, he was kind of a mass market guy who talked a lot about culture and the inherent supremacy of Western culture. And he kind of very much talked about things like the civilizing mission and that kind of thing. So I was very much kind of into him and the whole clash of civilizations and civilizational war. And yeah, so all those things happened during that time period. And eventually I kind of started to get into kind of mainstream conservatism. I guess kind of more neoconservatism, I guess you could say, but more radical. So my issue with neocons was that I didn't feel they went far enough with trying to bring about the world they wanted, that they weren't willing to use enough force to kind of bring it about. And I felt that they were kind of a cynical, they were kind of cynical. So that was kind of my issue with neocons. So eventually I kind of started getting into libertarianism, which is, I think, where a lot of people go in these circles, because you kind of realize that mainstream conservatism doesn't stand for anything in general. Like, it doesn't. It's not interested in changing society. It's not interested in forwarding a particular I guess, kind of a particular ideal. They don't have a way for how society works. They just want change, but at a slower rate. And I think a lot of people are drawn to libertarianism because it's kind of the most mainstream ideology that posits a worldview. So I started getting into Glenn Beck. I got into Ayn Rand. How old were you then? Neocon libertarian. I was in university, so I guess I was like 18 or 19 or 20 around that time period. So I think what kind of happened eventually was I kind of started to realize that a lot of things would just never come about. That just a lot of, I don't know if you want to call them third world people, were just uninterested in the kind of things that I wanted to bring about. They just innately didn't want those sorts of things. So I think kind of one of the issues with libertarianism that you run into is it ignores that all libertarians are middle to upper middle class white age heterosexual males, and that libertarianism doesn't appeal to anybody other than that very specific demographic group. Also that, I'm trying to remember what was the other thing about it. So there's that aspect to libertarianism. There's also the aspect that... I'm just trying to... Sorry, I'm losing my train of thought here. That aspect of libertarianism... Also, just it became increasingly difficult to ignore how highly correlated stuff is with races, with success, etc. So I kind of became disillusioned with libertarianism because I saw it as LARP. I saw it as something that had no mass appeal. And I saw it as something really much restricted to a very small amount of people. Because I think one of the bases of libertarianism is all people are fundamentally the same. And the idea is if you aren't successful, it's because you're lazy or you're unwilling to apply yourself or you're not willing to work hard. And as I kind of went through a lot of difficulties finding full-time work, seeing just kind of how affirmative action and that kind of stuff like that, I just increasingly became hostile to it. So, also, I thought I didn't like the fact that it ignored identity. I thought people needed identity, they needed guidance in life, and that sort of thing. And the fact that that stuff all existed bothered me. So it was around that time I came across NRX. I came across kind of early neo-reaction. I think the first thing I found that was kind of NRX was the Mad Monarchist. And I started kind of getting into monarchism. I found Areni about that time. I started running into that sort of thing. And kind of eventually as I got into NRX, I found TRS. And this was really old school TRS. This was back when TRS used to be more libertarian and more NRX and was less kind of racial. They were more like kind of a more radical version of just kind of Republicans and kind of conservative libertarians. So I started kind of getting into that. I started kind of listening to it. And that was back when I think TRS was a lot better back in the day. They were more intellectual back then. That was back when Bulbasaur wrote a lot of blogs. I got into Ramsey Paul around that time. I remember the exact moment I became a race realist was a video Ramsey Paul did about the 2 earthquakes. He talked about... Yeah, so there's 2 earthquakes. There was the earthquake in Haiti and the earthquake in Japan. And the earthquake in Japan, there was no rioting. There was no disorder. The people all calmly went and helped the other people, like dug them out of the mess. They gave them medical treatment. Like I said, there's no... Like I said, it was completely ordered. There was no rioting. There was no looting. There was no stealing. There was no murdering. And then in Haiti, TRS is the right stuff, which is kind of the, I guess you could say, the biggest kind of populist alt-right publication. So Beckloff is Bulbasaur. No, Bulbasaur is someone completely different. He was probably before your time. Bulbasaur was like the only... Bulbasaur and Hateful Heretic were the only 2 Christians who were regulars on TRS, and they both left. Bulbasaur left because TRS was too soft on race mixing, which was the actual reason, because... I'll get into that later, but... So Ramsey Paul said in Haiti, there was immediate looting, people were swinging machetes, there was a sense of total need and desperation. He talked about Hurricane Katrina. People immediately started looting. It's like there was no agency. They didn't try to help themselves at all. And then he talked about Detroit. And he said, I think, and this was the exact moment I became a race realist, he goes, let's do a thought experiment. If you were to take all the people in Detroit and put them in Nagasaki, and you were to take all the people from Nagasaki and put them in Detroit, if you went there in 50 years, Nagasaki would look like Detroit, and Detroit would look like Nagasaki is just innate to their people. People just act a priori in very specific ways. And it's just kind of an undeniable fact of reality. And then it was like, now everything makes sense. It was kind of like in... it was like in Evangelion episode 24 when it goes, now I understand, now everything makes sense. And as I started kind of viewing it, I started kind of getting into stuff like time preference, social trust, impulse control. It was around that time I found Stuff Black People Don't Like, which is a very strong condemnation of, I guess you could say, African American culture. It is just an utterly brutal thing. Like, it takes basically race realism and it just shoves it in your face, and it doesn't let you look away. So all that kind of thing. So I was really into TRS back then. I kind of started to get into kind of some other NRX stuff. And then NRX kind of eventually collapsed. And I think what happened to a lot of us, and this is kind of one of my big theories as to how the alt-right came about, was the whole Trayvon Martin thing, where it went from just being kind of passively anti-white to just being an all-out war on white people and white males in particular. Because it just showed how kind of morally bankrupt the left was. Because they were willing to defend people who were objective murderers, like who killed people, who rioted, looted, and robbed. And they were the lengths that they were willing to go just kind of sickened me. And it kind of went into a thing with just an attack on one is attack on all. Our people were just completely demonized. There was no room for us left in society. So it just, I think, more than anything else that's happened in the last couple decades, Black Lives Matter and that whole thing, I think, created a sense of white identity. Because I remember when Trayvon happened, the vast majority of white people didn't cuck on the issue. They said to something like to the effect of, like, no, Trayvon deserved it. Trayvon was a fucking degenerate gangbanger. George Zimmerman did nothing wrong. And most of the mainstream conservatives circled the wagon and defended Trayvon Martin. And so they lost a lot of credit with a lot of white people, because white people were like, we're not to blame for this. And as the Dindu, like another Dindu down just kept going on, it just got worse and worse and worse. Because... well, like I said, it's just, it just, white people in general, like, this is ridiculous. Why are we being blamed for these degenerate gangbangers dying when they deserved it, when they were committing federal offenses? And we're not going to take responsibility for this. We're not going to be blamed for their shitty behavior. And it just became more and more clear that it was about race, and it just got more and more radical as time went on. And... like Obama's whole, if I had a son, he would be Trayvon, I think also really started to kind of build a sense of identity, because people realized, oh, this is political. This is up to the highest levels of society. That people are this, like, politicized in. And then there was the whole beer summit and all this other things. So... all these things kind of happened, and I just kind of increasingly became more and more radical as time went on. And I also became Christian around this time. I converted to Catholicism. I kind of started to get a bit involved in traditionalism, etc. And kind of one of the main reasons I became race realist, like another really big example, was I went to Los Angeles, and I saw the way that blacks live in Los Angeles. They live like animals in Los Angeles. They just kind of lie in the streets. It's disgusting, just kind of the way they live there. it's disturbing. And I just was like, they're so unhappy, and they're so just, there's absolutely no dignity to their lives. And so I kind of went and I said, this is what trillions of dollars of welfare spending has brought us. It's brought us absolutely nothing. It hasn't advanced anybody. We just have to be separate because this isn't working. So I guess that's kind of time went on, and that's kind of how I got into this whole milieu. I've deleted it or taken it down, but really early when this channel started, it became conservative libertarian, and then it kind of became NRX, and then it just kind of became outright alt-right. The alt-right was kind of something that developed over time, depending on, as I said, just kind of the realities of the situation. The migrant crisis really changed things a lot too. But yeah, so that's kind of how I came to my current kind of standing. And then you get red pilled on a lot of other things. So yeah, I hope that kind of explains my perspective, how I got to where I was. So if people want to start asking me just kind of questions, go ahead. Are you going to get to the JQ? Are you changing your views on that? I just don't like to talk about that because that's like the number one thing that gets you shut down. I'll just say it now. I do know about Shlomo. I'm very aware about him. I'm very much aware of him. And kind of his games. At the same time, though, he only is able to do what white people let him do. I think there's sometimes a tendency to just blame him for bad decisions we people make. Very interesting path, similar to Mike Enoch's path. Stamp of approval. No, it's just like that's the number one thing that gets you shut down. That and talking about the Holocaust. Do you think multiculturalism is something that can work in the long run, or is it just a failed social experiment? Well, it depends. It depends. Like it's a very complicated phenomenon. I mean, it depends how one describes multiculturalism. Because there's been multicultural states. Like there was I'm trying to remember. Just thinking about it for a minute. Like the Austro-Hungarian Empire was multicultural, but it was a whole number of regions that were largely autonomous from one another. The different areas were autonomous. There wasn't a great deal of mixing between them, but the Habsburgs promoted local cultures in the various parts of their empire. Like they promoted the Polish culture, they promoted Croatian culture, etc., etc. So, in a sense, it was multicultural, but it was multicultural in a very different way. Also, the other thing kind of about it is it was natural, because there's all that stuff. Sorry, I'm just kind of trying to gather my thoughts here. The people were naturally in those areas. You have some areas that have natural, like Spain has natural kind of cultural diversity. Like different parts of Spain are naturally different from one another. And that's, so there's a certain group of, like, Spain is a cultural union, but the local, I guess, differences between the various peoples is natural. It's something that developed over time. It's not something that was a contrivance, I guess you could say. And then there's kind of there's places like the Roman Empire that was sort of multicultural. I guess you could say in a sense, although it was more kind of a dominant culture, where the idea was Roman culture would eventually kind of overwhelm the other cultures, that they would eventually become Romanized, and in them becoming Romanized, assassinations must be performed with the hidden blade. So the Romans kind of mixed cultures with Roman culture. The eventual idea, though, was to Romanize them and to eventually get them to become Roman in the way that they're kind of talking about it. So, I mean, it depends. Like, if it's natural, I think it can work out fine. Although there has to be some kind of division within the country. Like, in terms of Quebec, it has to be French, but the rest of the problem can be... yeah, so I hope that kind of answers the question. It depends whether it's natural or contrived. It depends how much autonomy the different parts of the country have from one another. So that's all kind of, I guess, my thoughts on it. What's your opinion of the distributist? Oh, yeah, so sorry, just briefly on the whole DSP thing. So I've taken... Okay, so Mer Stuff did a video called DSP Tries It, Casual Racism. So I actually went and I defended DSP on it. Let me find it. And I basically said he's not a racist in any meaningful sense. And it's just bullshit. It irritates me a lot that people attack him over that kind of thing. Because I don't really think he is at all. And I see it as, like, people use it as a justification for the really bad shit they've done to him. Like actively trying to fuck with him IRL. They explain that. But it just bothers me. It bothers me because it's also, I think it shows the moral bankruptcy of the left, because they don't care about the fact that DSP is a scammer, that he's a piece of shit for any number of reasons. Their main complaint about him was that he was... I'm trying to think how to describe it. That he is an evil racist. So, like, they just didn't particularly care about the other things, just some really lame stuff. I think Trump, Putin, and Kim Jong-un are going to start World War III. We have so many great discoveries in things like telomeres, restoration, automatic cars, but they don't matter. So fascist economics matter very much country to country. Fascism is the right-wing, because keep in mind, right-wing ideologies vary greatly based on what their host culture is. So you had places like Russia, where kind of the Nazbol movement there is outright anti-capitalist. It's outright socialist. No, sorry, it's not even just... it's not just socialist, it's actively, like, hardcore anti-capitalist. Within Spain... Okay, so let me just try to go over some examples of this. Fascism, I think it generally speaking promotes protectionism, the development of the national economy through a strong state, and class collaboration. Beyond that, I don't think it necessarily has prescribed economic ideas. It's very pragmatic on that. Like, Mussolini went through periods where he was more... I'm trying to think of how to describe it. Where he was more free market and periods where he was more socialist. Spain's economy under fascism was actually probably the closest we've ever had to a true socialist economy. Workers had a lot of... Well, no, Spain wasn't exactly fascist. I'm just saying, for example, of kind of like a very right-wing country. Workers had a lot of power within Spain. Like worker cooperatives, workers had more power than in just about any other society that I can think of. There's a lot of worker ownership of business. There was like a chamber of corporations. There was a lot of syndicalism. So Spain was probably like one of the most socialist countries ever created. And yeah, some countries went through periods where they were more free market. Other countries went through periods where they were more command economy. Generally speaking, though, fascist economics is kind of state capitalist or interventionist. Like kind of the pseudo-fascist governments you had in East Asia advocated large corporations. Very large corporations that are directed by the state. So there should be active cooperation between the private and public sector. That kind of thing. I think probably the best example of a fascist economy would be modern China. Because you have a mixture of protectionism, state involvement in the strong state involvement in the economy. The state... I don't know anything about the distributists. I've never been interested in distributism. Distributism is a retarded ideology. My issue with distributism... Well, there's lots of reasons. To have distributism, you would need an extremely strong state. You would need pretty much a totalitarian state that could monitor every aspect of people's life. You would also need like a police force that would go in and forcibly redistribute wealth every couple of years, because consolidation would inevitably happen. Also, distributism can't coexist with population growth. So if we have 3 acres and a cow... let me think. 3 acres and a cow, you would have eventually run out of 3 acres and cows to give out to everybody. So so it would involve forcible redistribution of wealth on a regular basis. Not just occasionally, but like I said, like on a regular basis, you would have to keep redistributing it. It would require abandoning all concept of economies of scale. It would leave you extremely open to attack by more centralized states. It would completely stop economic development. It's a disaster of an economic ideology. It's just LARP, is how I view it. It's just LARP, plain and simple. Opinion on the welfare state? I think welfare is okay. I think it just needs to be balanced. I'm pragmatic on it. If people can show me certain welfare programs work, okay. If people can show me certain welfares don't work, then that's okay too. But no. I've always been pretty staunchly anti-distributism. It's, as I said, I think it's a LARP ideology. Do you disagree with NRX about economics? What is NRX economics? That's kind of like what my question would be. Is NRX economics libertarianism? What else is it? Libertarianism or distributism, neither of which I really like, so... I have no idea what the scale hypothesis is, to be perfectly honest. As for should redheads and blondes be given incentives, I don't know. I've just never really been interested in Austrian economics. I guess like one kind of my issues with Austrian economics was I read a book about it, and one of the things they said in it was that the space race was really bad. They said the space race was like the greatest misuse of resources in human history and was like objectively evil, and that kind of made me hate um, Austrian economics because I really like NASA and I really like the space race. I really like the space program, so it just kind of seemed like they just kind of reduced everything to economics, which I just don't really agree with. Are you implying that most of DSP's detractors are liberals? I do think most of them are, to be perfectly honest. There's some people like me, but most of them I think are. Or there are just like apolitical people who are liberals by default. DSP, yeah, DSP is really left wing. I don't get it. It's it's like the people who attack. It's like the people who attack Christian for some like dumb shit he said in the past. Like that's the main issue they have with him. Not that he's a fucking weirdo. Not that there's not that he's a weirdo. Not that he's a degenerate. Not that he's like kind of a psycho. That sort of thing. With regards to monarchy, I'm pretty much completely ambivalent about monarchy. I don't particularly care about it, to be honest. I If it works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't. Something I do believe very much in is a very strong executive. Be that in a republic or in a monarchy. I do also believe in life, probably life, but with opportunities to. Oh yeah, people got really triggered because I call common law common degeneracy. So people get really triggered whenever I would say that about DSP. Yes, I want double assassination. So no, like, because I think, like, either you should have a strong, like, president, preferably a president for life, or a monarch, but they should have a lot of executive power. I kind of do think if you're going to have a president for life, there should be regular referendums where like a 2/3 majority can remove them for power, because there has to be some mechanism to remove them. With regards to democracy, it depends what one means by democracy. If we mean that everybody can vote, then yes, I dislike it. If we mean that you have some form of elected representation, then I support that very strongly. This whole meme about like absolute monarchy, this whole idea about there's absolute monarchy. Is a meme. I think people need to have a place that they can make their concerns heard, and that was, I think, the downfall of most of the absolute monarchies. Is at the beginning there was a lot of conservatives in Russia who were like, look, we just want a very basic set of laws. We want just like the property classes to elect our own to elect their own representatives and that kind of thing. But the Tsar refused, and that eventually led to the Bolsheviks. That also kind of happened in France. That happened in a lot of absolute monarchies. Is the monarchy collapsed because they weren't willing to make reasonable concessions to parties who otherwise like them. With regards to democracy in terms of different peoples, I do think it matters a lot based on the people. I think in terms of... I'm trying to think about it. What are the different ones? I think Asians are just naturally don't like democracy. And even in countries that are nominal democracies, they just don't even operate on it. Like, Japan is not like a de facto democracy. Like, it's a de jure democracy, but Japan is a de facto one-party state. Singapore is a de facto one-party state. I'm trying to think of what are some other ones. Korea was kind of for a while, but it just seems like that's more natural for Asians to have like a one-party conservative technocratic state. And that sort of thing. Blacks do best when there's a really strong leader who's able to, keep them in line. Yeah, but that's I think that's just about everything I wanted to talk about today. I try not to keep these longer than like an hour to an hour and a half. So anyways, guys, I'm going to head out. So I'll do another stream sometime soon, and everybody have a Happy New Year's.